You are told that sovereignty is absolute, that borders define power, that nations rise or fall by armies and elections. None of that is true anymore. Today, power works differently. A country can keep its flag, its capital, even its president, and still lose control of its future. Not through invasion, not through war, but through something quieter, cleaner, and far more effective. Control the money, control the oil, control the ships before they ever reach port. When a single decision in Washington can decide whether a nation is allowed to sell its own resources, sovereignty becomes conditional, not abolished, licensed. And Venezuela is not the exception. It is the test case. If you want to understand where global power is actually exercised in 2025 and why this model is spreading far beyond Latin America, stay with me. This is not about ideology. It's about systems. Because once you see how this works, you can't unsee what comes next. What you are watching is not foreign policy. It is a control architecture. In this system, tanks are optional. Elections are secondary. What matters is access to money, to markets, to energy routes. The rules are simple. A government is allowed to function only if its economic lifelines remain open. And those lifelines are no longer domestic. They run through banks, shipping lanes, insurance markets, and legal jurisdictions far beyond national borders. This is why modern power no longer asks, who governs a country? It asks something colder. Who decides whether that country can sell, ship, and get paid? Once that question is answered, everything else follows. Budgets collapse. Alliance fracture. Political survival becomes a negotiation, not a choice. Venezuela is where this system is being applied most visibly. But the logic behind it is global. And to understand how this control is enforced, without invasion, without occupation, we need to look at where theory turns into action. That brings us to the machinery behind it all. To understand how this system emerged, you have to step back. For decades, power was enforced through presence, bases, troops, occupation. That model was costly, visible, and politically corrosive. Then the system evolved. Globalization rewired sovereignty itself. Oil no longer mattered where it was pumped, but where it could be sold. Money no longer lived in vaults, but in clearing systems, insurance contracts, and dollar-denominated flows. Slowly, quietly, leverage migrated. By the time Venezuela collapsed into economic crisis, the tools were already in place. Sanctions were not just punishment, they were architecture. Financial access became permission. Shipping lanes became checkpoints. This was not improvisation. It was institutional learning. After Iraq, after Afghanistan, Washington absorbed a lesson. You don't need to occupy a country to control it. You only need to control what keeps it alive. Venezuela, rich in oil and isolated from markets, became the perfect proving ground. And once that groundwork was laid, enforcement no longer required speeches or threats. It required action. The system stayed abstract until the first ship was taken. Not a speech, not a warning, a tanker. A vessel carrying Venezuelan oil was intercepted at sea, quietly removed from circulation, and reassigned by force of law. No invasion, no declaration of war, just a decision executed. Then it happened again. One of those tankers appeared to be sailing under a Russian flag. A deliberate signal, a test. The assumption was simple. Surely the United States would hesitate. Surely great power symbols still offered protection. They didn't. The ship was seized anyway. In that moment, the theory became reality. Flags didn't matter. Ownership didn't matter. Only control did, and the message was unmistakable. Energy does not belong to whoever extracts it, but to whoever permits it to move. If this kind of power shocks you, it should, because it tells us where the real battlefield is now. And it isn't on land. It's in shipping lanes, legal jurisdictions, and financial clearings. That single seizure revealed something much deeper. To understand it, we have to look beneath the surface. at the mechanism that makes this kind of enforcement possible. What made that seizure possible wasn't brute force. It was infrastructure. Modern power doesn't sit in armies. It sits in contracts, in insurance clauses, in shipping registries, in financial clearing systems that decide which transaction is legitimate and which one simply doesn't exist. Every barrel of oil needs permission long before it reaches a refinery. Permission to be insured, permission to dock, permission to be paid. Remove any one of those, and the oil might as well be worthless. This is the hidden mechanism. When a state controls the currency others must use, the legal system ships must obey, and the maritime routes energy must cross, it doesn't need to blockade a country. It can selectively suffocate it. This is why sovereignty no longer collapses all at once. It erodes. Budgets shrink quietly. Maintenance stops. Allies drift away. Political choices narrow into survival calculations. By the time the world notices, the outcome is already locked in. And once this mechanism is activated, enforcement becomes repeatable, predictable, escalatory, which is exactly why the first seizure was never meant to be the last. The system was just getting started. Once the mechanism was exposed, evasion became inevitable. The ships didn't stop moving. They just changed masks. A tanker reappeared this time under a different flag, a Russian flag, or at least what looked like one. Reflagging is an old trick. Hide behind a great power. Raise the cost of enforcement. Force hesitation. It didn't work. The vessel was tracked, identified, and taken anyway. That moment mattered more than the oil on board, because it erased a myth that association with a major power still guaranteed protection. It didn't. The seizure sent a second message, sharper than the first. There would be no safe intermediaries, no neutral flags, no plausible deniability. Anyone moving sanctioned energy would be treated as part of the system, not an exception to it. This is how pressure scales, not by expanding territory, but by collapsing escape routes. Each interception narrowed the options. Each enforcement action increased the cost of resistance. And as the routes closed, something else began to happen quietly inside the country itself. Because when the exits disappear, the pressure doesn't stay at sea. It moves inward toward people who have no ships, no flags, and no leverage at all. And this is where the system stops being abstract. Because when oil can't move, money doesn't arrive. When money doesn't arrive, salaries disappear. Hospitals go dark. Water systems fail. Food becomes a negotiation. If you live inside that country, none of this feels strategic. It feels personal. You didn't choose shipping lanes. You didn't sign energy contracts. You didn't decide which flag a tanker flies, but you live with the consequences. Inflation isn't a number to you. It's a shelf that's empty, a medicine you can't replace, a future that quietly shrinks. This is the cruel efficiency of modern pressure. It bypasses governments and settles directly on households. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The system counts on that pressure breaking something. If this makes you uneasy, it should. Because once economic survival becomes leverage, ordinary people become the terrain. And when that happens, the story no longer belongs to one country. It becomes global. Because this model doesn't end where it started. What happens next never stays local. Once this model proves effective, it doesn't remain an exception. It becomes a template. Other states take notes. Energy producers watch carefully. So do buyers, because when access to markets becomes conditional, neutrality collapses. Countries are no longer asked where they stand. They are told. Supply chains begin to realign around permission rather than price. Discount oil vanishes. Insurance costs spike. Shipping routes narrow. And the pressure radiates outward. China recalculates its energy security. Regional powers reassess who can actually guarantee delivery. Smaller states learn a new lesson. Reserves underground are meaningless if the exits are controlled. This is how geopolitics hardens into economics. And economics hardens into alignment. The global system doesn't fracture all at once. It polarizes quietly. Every enforcement action redraws invisible boundaries. Who can trade? Who can move? Who can profit? And as those boundaries settle, one question becomes unavoidable. What happens when this logic stops being tactical and becomes permanent? That's where the future begins. From here, the system branches into three possible futures. In the first, the pressure works. Compliance replaces resistance. Market access is restored under supervision. Oil flows again, but on new terms. Sovereignty survives, but only as a managed condition. Stable, profitable, and tightly integrated into the system that enforced it. In the second, the world adapts. States learn to hedge. Alternative routes emerge. New payment systems, new insurers, new intermediaries. The architecture holds but weakens. Power becomes contested rather than absolute. And enforcement grows more frequent, more aggressive to compensate. And in the third, the model overreaches. Economic pressure hardens into political backlash. Populations reject permanent coercion. Alliances form not around ideology, but around insulation. The system meant to enforce order begins to fragment the global economy instead. None of these futures is abstract. All are already visible in pieces. What matters is which one becomes dominant. Because once sovereignty is treated as conditional in one place, it never stays confined there. The logic spreads. The thresholds lower, and the question shifts from, can this be done, to who is next? That question leads us to the final insight. What we are witnessing is not a crisis. It's a transition. Power is no longer measured by how many soldiers you deploy, but by how many permissions you control. Who can sell, who can ship, who can get paid. In this world, sovereignty isn't taken, it's conditioned. And that changes everything. Because once control is exercised without occupation, without war, without visible violence, it becomes easier to repeat, cleaner to justify, harder to resist. Venezuela is not the end of this story. It's the opening chapter. The real question is not whether this system works. It already does. The real question is how far it goes and what happens when more nations realize they're living inside it. If you want to understand where global power is moving next, you have to stop watching elections and start watching systems. Because the future of geopolitics won't be decided by speeches. It will be decided by access. And in the next video, we'll look at where this model is already being tested again, and why the next confrontation may look nothing like the last. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me. What comes next matters even more.